Hello. Today I'm going to film this video out of character because I want to talk about something a bit more complex and less fun than usual. I basically want to make videos about history, mythology, culture, fantasy, and promote Eastern European and Middle Eastern, and of course, throughout all of that, actual Caucasian culture. But in doing so, I have to mention the elephant in the room, which I sort of did in the last video: Russia and Russian imperialism that's affecting us, Ukrainians, and everyone that they can grab their hands. I had a hard time talking about this topic because, as I mentioned in the last video, talking about knights and heroes and soldiers and wars, it's well and good when you're talking about in the general history, but it's not as pleasant when it's wars and battles are actually taking place around you right now. And I almost didn't start my channel because of the conflict that is going on in Ukraine right now. But I have to face it, and I, as someone who is a fan of history and someone who is a Georgian, I think I have a responsibility to talk about this topic and, of course, mention the side of view of Georgians. I'm not an expert on anything, but I am a Georgian, and I have lived through many of these conflicts and have at least general understanding of history behind it. Unfortunately, when people talk about Georgia, and Georgia, of course, comes a lot in this topic because the conflict that is going on in Ukraine actually started in Georgia. This is all a modern version of Russian imperialist conquest of his former colonies. And Georgia was the testing ground of what Russia can get away with. And as we saw in Georgia, they can get away with anything. It is very nice to see that finally Western Europe united and actually is helping Ukraine right now. Would be nice if they helped us too, but we're winning now, hopefully, as God wills it. So, through this topic, when war, conflict, Russian imperialism, Ukraine comes up, often Georgia also comes up, but it's often people who don't know a lot about Georgian history and only mention 2008 war or generally mention the 90s conflicts or in vague terms talk about historical Russian imperialism. Or if someone talks about Georgia, it's often those many Russian bloggers that all flock to Georgia right now. Welcome, I guess. Would be nice if you visited in a nicer climate. But still in this topic, Georgian voice isn't really heard. I'm not anyone special about this. I'm just a nerd who likes fantasy and wants to introduce more Eastern European version of fantasies in Western storytelling. That's my general goal. But as a Georgian, I think I have to say a few things, general, not opinions, and I would also like to talk about my opinions because I'm self-centered and like to hear my own voice a lot. But in this situation, I really want to give context of what's been going on in Caucasus, what's been going on from the perspective of Georgian and Georgian, and how much Eastern Europe is affected by Russian imperialism and colonialism. For that, I apologize. This video is going to be a bit longer than usual. It's actually should be way longer because any topic that I have listed that I want to mention, I want to talk about this topic in much more detail later on. So I'll mention every topic that I glance over in this video. It's going to be probably a long video, but every topic I just mention a little bit of it. I will not mention dates. I will not mention a lot of names because that's my biggest weakness, and I need to do a serious research on each topic to make a dedicated video about this topic that I will be proud of. But in this video, I will mention general history about Russian involvement in Georgia and in general in the Caucasus. So to give a slight context about this whole situation from again my personal perspective. There we go. First, this conflict actually begins in the 3,000 years ago when Greek invaders, thieves, stole the golden fleece from Colchis. Well, of course, I'm joking right now. But of course, as we know, history, every action has its reaction and everything creates the situation. But before we talk about Russian invasion and colonialization of Caucasus, I need to talk about prehistory before then. And let's take last 1,000 years. Last 1,000 years ago, Georgia and Caucasus were in general peace. Of course, there is no peace in Caucasus. We are constantly fighting either massive empires, or if there is no other empire to fight, we fight each other. In that period, there was, for example, Georgian Golden Age, which we managed to unite all of South Caucasus and have great relationship with the northern Caucasian peoples and tribes as well. But during that Golden Age, when everything was going great, Mongolians invaded and wrecked everyone's shit. Sorry for cursing, but they destroyed, ravaged everything, ended the whole age. Like, Middle East never recovered. We kinda never actually recovered from that, and they spread the plague. They basically, you know the history. Everyone knows the general history of Mongolian invasion. But the first general invasion of our great man Genghis Khan did take over Georgia. There, again, historical context needed. I will make a special dedicated video about this topic because it's really complex and really interesting, and I really think about what if we something. We'll talk about this later. We managed, after the first dissolution of Mongolian Empire into smaller hordes, we managed to carve our little territory, not as great as it was, but a Silver Age, smaller but still strong Georgian kingdom managed to carve itself out from the horde. But later on, we were besieged, invaded, and ravaged by an underrated monster throughout history. Not a lot of people talk about him, unfortunately. Timur Leng, or Timur the Lame, as we like to call him. He's, I think, top 5 worst human beings to ever live. Like, most of top 5 are modern people who had modern technology just to ravage the world. But this guy did horrible, unspeakable evil with Middle Ages technology. So, as someone who was ravaged and destroyed by his actions, I still have to say, really underrated. Check him out. See all the horrors he brought upon this world. One of the horrible things he did is declare jihad on all Georgians. Like, jihad on existence of Georgians. he decided to wipe us off the face of Earth. And he almost succeeded. But after 8 or 9 times invading Georgia, and I mean, not just usually when someone invades, they loot shit. Sorry again, cursing. Loot everything. Take slaves, take gold, and establish their rule. Not this guy. He destroyed, burned. If he saw a stone still standing, he would kick it. He destroyed everything, killed everyone inside, and almost completely killed most of us. After that, we never, even to this day, we kind of recovered, but never truly recovered. After that absolute wiping us out, but in the end, he still like said, "Fine, I lost, I leave." Well, it's like everything is buried. Like two Georgians survived, and I'm like, "Yay, victory!" No, it was he technically lost, but we never recovered. After that period, Georgia and Armenia and Azerbaijan and the other Caucasus were besieged by two imperial forces, from one from Ottoman Empire and the other from Persians, and we were constantly in the middle of this combat. Basically, history of Georgia and the Caucasus is written by other empires fighting on our land. Either it was Rome or Greece or someone fighting Persians or Sassanids or Medians or someone and someone. Battleground was always here. So in all those conflicts, we were the ones who suffered the most. And during the conflict in last century, when Western Europe was in like Renaissance and Enlightenment and everything was going great, we were being ravaged beyond comprehension. Even after Timur Lenk, we were busy. It is unimaginable to describe what horrors Caucasian people went through this time. And rather than unite and stand as one force and fight back, we even dissolved into far smaller kingdoms, tribalism took over, and something even worse became predominant in Caucasus, which is really horrible, slavery. This form of slavery was predominant in all of Caucasus, which was stealing young men and young women for being men were sent in to be elite soldiers of either Mamluks or Janissaries in either Arab or Persian or different worlds, and women were kidnapped and sold into harems, which modern estimates estimate that around 14 million people, not immediately, like throughout 500 or more years, have been kidnapped and sold into slavery, which is horrible. And unfortunately, this is really tragic. Not only our conquerors and imperial overlords would kidnap people, a lot of the times tribal warfare and neighboring peoples would kidnap children from other from their brothers, basically. Or even more horrible, reading about this like broke my mind, people would have children to sell them. This is beyond understanding how horrible this is. They would have children to later sell them. This is incredibly horrible. This is the situation when Russian Empire comes into picture. But before then, before Russia truly enters the frame, we had a slight sliver of hope with King Heraclius II. There is also Heraclius I, which is also involved in Russian imperialism. I will talk about this later. Of course, I will talk about Mamluks and Janissaries and Georgian legionnaires warring in other regions. That is also a really interesting topic. But continuing in the basically last, I would say, at the end of the 18th century, we had the king Heraclius II, who somehow, basically miraculously, managed to free small sliver of Georgia. If you have seen Georgia, it's tiny, but imagine even the tiny region was separated in two different kingdoms. Uh, and one of the kingdoms, King Heraclius, Bagrationi, the great Bagrationi family, which is one of the oldest dynasties in the world and the oldest dynasty in Europe, he managed to carve some sort of peace, some sort of stability in this small region of Georgia, managed to broker peace with both Persians and Ottomans, fought slavery and the kidnapping of children, managed to establish culture and diplomacy with other nations, and tried his best to find allies in Western Europe, which is a very interesting topic in itself, where basically we tried to start another crusade. Honestly, Georgians and other Eastern Europeans united to ask, or I think France and other European nations to start another crusade to save us, but they didn't. They just sent a bunch of preachers, and there are still some Catholic Georgians from that time period. Only people who kinda answered. There was, which is I'm not going into that topic. There was a possibility, like during Crimean Wars, we could have allied with either England or France or someone else, but only player who was actually interested in the region was Russia. So here comes Russia in the picture. Russia during that time was trying to wipe out and colonize northern Caucasus. They were fighting Circassians or Cherkess peoples, which are a really interesting group of northern Caucasians. Unfortunately, they Russians succeeded in almost completely wiping them out, which is another very interesting and complex topic. During the time, there were a bunch of Georgians actually living with Russian in the Russian Empire, and those Georgian politicians and nobles tried to broker a relationship between Caucasus, specifically Georgia, and Russia. Russia during that time was trying to establish himself as the protector of Christianity in the Caucasus and the Middle East, basically using us and Armenians and other Caucasians and other nations who kept the Christianity during that Islamization of the region as a proxy to involve itself in the region and come as a third imperial power and take over. So they needed Georgia because Caucasus is a giant mountainous region that has only few areas that a military troop can walk through, and Georgians always control those territories. And without Georgians, they couldn't cross over the mountains. So Russians and Georgians, again, really deep, complicated topic, which has spies on both sides involving blah, 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 blah. I'll talk about it later. So we made a deal with Russian Empire, a pact, a Georgiev's Tractate, which stated that we would become under their protection, and being under their protection, we would keep our religious autonomy, we would keep our regional autonomy, we will keep our noble family intact. Basically, we would be still an independent nation that worked for Russian interest and were basically vassals, emissaries for Russians in the Caucasus. Unfortunately, we were bamboozled, we were lied to, we were tricked, and we paid for trusting Russians dearly. We let the Russian troops in by the deal that those soldiers would protect us because we had a deal with Persians of neutrality. By making a deal with Russia, we would break the truce with Persia. By aligning ourselves with their enemy, they would declare war on us. So we let a bunch of Russian soldiers in the hopes that those soldiers would protect us from Persia because we let them in. So, like, it's a complicated issue. When Persians invaded, Georgian, unfortunately, our king Heraclius II didn't really prepare all that seriously. He thought that they made a deal with a nation, a fellow Christian nation, as they like to constantly lie to us, that Russia is a brotherly Christian nation. He trusted that brotherly Christian nation that they would upkeep the deal and help us in the battle. But no, Russians didn't show up, and Georgians had to defend themselves alone. There is like a urban legend or a myth about this war that when Persians came, they saw so many cannons before the gates of Tbilisi, and they decided to turn back. But unfortunately, Georgians didn't have cannoneers, so it was all for show. And some secret spy ran out and told the leader of the Persians that, oh, don't actually have cannoneers, and it's like a historical meme that persists to this day. I don't know about this authenticity, but the fact is that we fought our best. Persians won. They ravaged the region, destroyed Tbilisi, burned it to the ground. Actually, Tbilisi was burned about 30 times. It's one of the most burned cities, I guess. Um, and kidnapped a lot of native people, Georgians, into modern day Iran. And to this day, there is a large diaspora of Georgians in Iran. After that absolute destruction, the small sliver of peace and harmony we had created was completely destroyed. We had no fighting chance left in us. Then the Russian soldiers that we let in to protect us conquered us, destroyed us, took over other regions of the Caucasus, using a lot of our own men. That is unfortunate fact of history is that a lot of Georgian lords joined Russia and Russian Empire and became just another Russian imperial subjects, and because they wanted to be part of a much larger and greater empire, I guess. They deported our king and wiped out our royal family, which was one of the oldest in the world and the oldest in Europe, the Bagrationi family. They then did the thing they promised they would never even think about doing. They took away our autocephaly, which is independent religious practice of Georgia. Georgian church was established in the 5th century, and we gained us and Armenians and Ethiopians were first Christian nations, taking away our church's independence, which is one of the oldest in the world, is one of the greatest atrocities that we Georgians think of what Russians did to us. Basically, they outlawed Georgian chant, which is, check out Georgian chant. It's one of the best. It's better than Gregorian. Georgian chant is better than Gregorian chant. Fight me. And basically tried to Russify all of Georgia. They succeeded with some Georgians, especially the nobility. A lot of Georgian nobility, which were like, oh, ancient nobility coming from the like bloody blah family, changed their last names, Russified their last names, Russified their own speech, their own traditions, and became just another Russian general in their army. And unfortunately, that is a great shame to our nation. A lot of those former Georgian nobles became generals in Russian army and did horrible things in the Caucasus and in the other wars, other imperialist wars of Russia. That unfortunately we have to bear it and we have to atone for our sins because even though they were like nobility and some small portion of an ancient forgotten period, there still are people who did a horrible crimes against our brothers and other nations who were oppressed by Russian imperialism. Unfortunately, that's not unique to the situation. Often Georgians were used by our imperial overlords to fight their wars, and that's a lot of where Mamluk ideas came from. That's a whole nother topic. After Russians took control of Georgia and the Caucasus, uh, I have to acknowledge that some benefit was brought to Georgia and its many regions, especially Tbilisi, because it became the capital of all of Caucasia, and a lot of actually competent rulers from Russian Empire came to Georgia and actually did some good. I'm not going to argue against it. Most of it was done for Russian nobility, but when I have to acknowledge something good that was done, Georgia and Tbilisi was rebuilt after Persians literally burned it to the ground because Russians. So they basically to this day, a lot of Russians and a lot of traitorous Georgians use that topic that, oh, they protected our Christianity, they helped us recover because we were like barely even a million population. Uh, they united the Georgian nations that were scattered during that time. They made our region more important. They gave us stability. But being a comfortable slave is still being a slave. But I think to be objective, I need to acknowledge that there were some benefits to Russian occupation and Russian imperialist conquest, but they are completely overshadowed by genocides of other Caucasians and even Georgians, especially Georgian Muslims and other nations that live in Georgia and in the Caucasus were targeted. They were ethnically cleansed, and many of them had to flee as muhajirs in other nations. Most of them went to Ottoman Empire. A lot of them went to other regions, but most of them were killed during those imperialist conquests. As I said, some of them were, some of the generals were unfortunately of Georgian birth, but we completely denounce them and say, fuck those guys. So during that time came a next generation of Georgia that was more stable and had more connection to Europe through Russia. Russia isn't that European, if you ask me, but still, during that Russian imperialism, especially Peter the Great, tried to connect Russia to Europe far more, and European influence was much greater to Georgia. And next generations of intellectuals and free thinkers, poets, artists, writers came to be after Russians established general peace and stability in the region. Georgia was turned into a tourist spot. Basically, became a this for Russian Empire. It was much warmer than most of Russian lands. You could imagine most of Russia is in the north and it's cold, and Georgia is in much more warmer climate We had far better cuisine and culture, and Georgia became basically first time in our history became a tourist destination for the nobles and for the intellectuals of the Russian upper class of the Russian Empire. Basically, every great Russian you can think of from the Russian Empire spent a lot of time in Georgia, and Tbilisi and Kutaisi and Batumi and other regions became basically bourgeois spaces for all the fancy European progressive thinking Russian imperial subjects, not just Russians. All the imperial subjects used to hang around here, and there came a new wave of intellectuals, of people, Georgians who thought more progressively and thought looked towards Western Europe and even to America to create a modern, democratic, liberal country, not a imperial subject or a squabbling kingdom. Previous generation of nobles who, as I stated before, became Russified and went into their service and became another tool for their imperialist conquest. A lot of them bankrupted themselves because they were hosting all those Russian tourists that used to come here. Even the Russian noble family spend a lot of times here. They even have their own castles, and it's really interesting to see like old Russian imperialist architecture that was prevalent in Georgia back then. Because, as I said, a lot of rich people came here to get away from Russian cold, basically. This older generation of nobility bankrupted themselves from throwing out huge parties with lords and ladies who literally held larger territories than there was the whole of Georgia. So, like a one Georgian lord held the territory of like a modern ranch and had to host a lord Russian noble who had the territory twice and 5 times larger than Georgia. So they constantly threw a lot of parties and bankrupted themselves. I'm not going to go into details. Another interesting topic for later on. But then came next generations of intellectuals. So this new generation of intellectuals started studying Western literature, studying their history, going out into the West to study, and bringing more progressive ideas to Georgia and trying to build a foundation to create a modern European style capitalist, democratic, liberal country. A lot of them, this movement was spearheaded by Ilya Chauchawadze, Nodar Dumbadze, Agagi Tsereteli, Wajab Shawala, and many other poets and writers and artists. But during that time, another more also influenced by Western ideas, a lot of communists gathered and congregated in Georgia. You probably heard of some of them. Not gonna name names, but you know whose. Actually, also try to take on Western ideals, but Western ideals of communism and Marxism and all that garbage. So while a lot of intellectuals try to establish a modern European Georgia, others went into deep into Russia and started the revolution there. During the revolution, for 3 years, Georgia actually managed to create an independent state, quote unquote independent state. And in those 3 years, we gave women the ability to vote. A lot of women were politicians came about. A lot of restructuring of society came about, and we really had a future planned out for us to actually create something great. But unfortunately, Ilya Ceaușescu was assassinated before Georgia managed to gain independence, and a lot of more still leftist-leaning politician came to be in charge. During that time, when Russia was fighting with itself, with the Reds and Whites, communist revolutionaries versus imperialist Russians, a lot of Russians came to Georgia. It's really interesting how history repeats itself. A lot of middle class and educated Russians ran from all the conflict between Reds and Whites and came to Georgia. There was a lot of writing from that period, how Tbilisi became Russified and how many Russians came to Georgia to escape the conflict that was brewing in the nation. And when the Reds came, unfortunately, those Russians who actually fled them helped them to take over in Georgia. Then the Reds came. Unfortunately, when the Reds came, our previous government of 3 years ran off into France, which is another interesting topic. Unfortunate, with a lot of sad twists and turns. There is a large Georgian diaspora in France, and rather than stand against Soviet incursion, our government basically fled, leaving us without ability to organize and fight. We of course fought still, a lot of them unorganized, a lot of them it's a really complicated topic. Basically, I didn't mention before, but even throughout Russian imperialist period and throughout Soviet Union especially, there were a lot of attempts to secede, to start a revolution, to gain independence from Russian imperialist hold, including my great grandfather was, I think, second or third attempt at revolution. Was one of the organizers, one of the leaders, and he was sent to Gulag for that. That's where he met my great grandmother. I'm partially Siberian, so that's another connection with Russia that I have. And a lot of other nobles. My great grandfather was also a minor noble. He was sent to Gulag, most of them, and then assassinated. Shot, killed. Most other nobles, intellectuals, and upper and middle class, all of the Georgian upper and middle class, were wiped out through series of different secret police killings, gulags, just rounding them up in train carts and burning and shooting those train carts and burying them alive. A lot of horrible stuff went on during Georgian Sovietization period. And those they didn't kill were gulagized. I think that's correct. Gulagized, yes, including the rest of my family, and that also created famines, a lot of destruction. All of those lands were like held by families for hundreds and hundreds, maybe even thousands of years, and then some Russian comes in and says that your whole territory that your family has been working on for literal thousands or hundreds of years is now everybody's, and you don't have any claim to it. It's a really traumatic experience. Also, another traumatic experience was destruction of our religious centers. Christianity is a really deep and important part of our culture, and during Sovietization there was a dedicated mass project to wipe all traces of religious identity from Georgians. And the funniest thing is modern day Russians and Russianized Georgians, aka Gruzins, talk about how Stalin was this saint and protector of Christianity who literally was there and signed up for most of its destruction. And came the period of Soviet Union. During Soviet Union, there was many attempts to wipe out the sense of ethnicity. It was really an interesting project that also deserves a video on its own. That their project was to basically erase all forms of ethnicity other than Russianhood. They would like claim that even they were like trying to wipe out even Russian ethnicity, but to create one massive collective workers' identity. But in reality, that one collective identity was Russian identity. You got to understand that Russians change ideology like they change their underwear. They're still Russians underneath. Ideology means nothing to them. But silly as it sounds, they still believe it. They still believe their own propaganda, but it still means nothing to them. So during that time, there was massive dedicated effort before imperialist Russia was trying to basically subjugate other ethnicities and feel the sense of superiority that they have subjugated these, like for example they thought of Caucasians as like oriental, like wild savages, North Caucasian barbarians, and South Caucasians beautiful maidens that need to be rescued from all those evil Islamic barbarians that are like all those. It's a whole interesting subject on its own, like um, orientalization of Georgia, basically to imperialist Russia, Georgia and Caucasus in particular, was what India was to England, let's just say that. But during Soviet Union, there was same tactic, but to completely nullify and Russify all forms of ethnicity and diversity in all people. It's a really complicated topic that I hopefully one day will talk about it with research and statistics and pictures and stuff like that. But during that time, we managed to somehow try to avoid being like homogenized and ethnically assimilated into Russian identity. So they changed tactics and again still trying to Russify, not Russify, create a new Soviet man from Georgian and create our cultural identity and our sense of identity into this like clownish version of our uh, basically again turning us into like tourist attraction basically. When in the Russian imperialist regime, Georgia was for the nobility and the upper classes. Later on in Soviet Union, Georgia became this hotspot, a tourist destination for all the top workers and chinovniks. So Georgians became these like clownish versions of ourselves, wiping out off all the honor and dignity and turning us into uh, a Gruzin, which is a slur we use against Russified Georgians who like are grotesque caricatures of what a real Georgian should be. Well, what is a real Georgian? It's a complicated topic on its own, but what they are is a gross caricature. You like fat, like constantly drunk, like Russian version of a Georgian, like Russian drunk, but not drunk on vodka, drunk on wine, basically. That's what they wanted to create out of us. During the time, as I said, there were many protests and attempts to resign and to secede from the union. Uh, and one of those protests, fortunately, came through in the 90s, and we were one of the, I think, the first nation to declare independence from like the general collective of Russia, not part of the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact was already disintegrating, but from the general greater USSR, basically. And then comes the third age of Russian imperialism. Now Russians are capitalist pig dogs that they hated so much, and became the ethnic conflicts that shaped the region to this day. Going back to Soviet Union, actually those ethnic conflicts were, it's really interesting if you think about it, they were pre-created, pre-planned. A lot of, for example, in Ukraine, a lot of Russian minorities that live in Ukraine and are wanting to join Russia were moved into Ukraine during that Sovietization of ethnic homogenization and ethnic resettlement. It was horrible. Like a lot of Northern Caucasians, and there were plans of, it's a, again, complicated topic. We'll talk about it later. But there was a whole attempt of reshuffle all the ethnicities, mix them up so they dissolve and mix into this one large Russian whole. And for example, Crimea was majority Tatar and Ukrainian, and a lot of those Tatars were forcibly relocated. Many of them died on their journey, and Russian speakers were sent there. That's also in Donbass, in those regions. That also suffered centuries before, like Russification of Ukrainian language and identity. It's a complicated topic on its own. But going back to Georgia, conflicts such as South Ossetia, South Ossetia and Abkhazia and Ajara and the other regions as well were created in the hopes that if Soviet Union was destabilized, the conflicts they created and harbored would reignite. Basically, it was like creating cold ethnic tensions. So if the Russian hand, imperialist hand, let go, the iron fist was taken off, we would immediately start eating each other and starting to fight with one another. So Russians would have a reason to come back and impose their imperialist hand, because, oh, you can't live without our iron fist up your ass, basically. So Stalin himself actually created South Ossetia. There was no such thing as South Ossetia. There was one Ossetia, Alania, in the north, because there's like talk because his father was Ossetian, so there were like small minority of Ossetians there. Again, complicated topic, needs a lot of research and studies and references to pull up, and gave independent region status to Abkhazia, which of course was an important part of Georgia and has different ethnicities there. There was whole genocide of Circassians and Abkhazians during Russian imperialism, and during Soviet Union, a lot of Georgians were sent into all the Abkhazian territories. I'm going to admit that, but it is wrong to say that there were no Georgians there, because there were. There is also another complicated topic about who was there before a few 100,000 years ago and blah, 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 blah. I'm not going to go into this now, but if it's not important who was there few 100,000 years ago, it's important to create stability and rekindle brotherhood now. But it's another complicated history. So during the Soviet Union, Abkhazians gained some autonomy, and there was created the whole topic of Abkhazian independence and South Ossetian independence to create cold conflicts, as I said, that would later flare up when Soviet Union fell apart, including Achara, which had a large Muslim population, and I'm going to mention this, but I'm not going to go into this deeper. Also, Migrelian and Svan populations, which are ethnic, other ethnic Georgian groups. There are multiple different Georgian ethnicities. Georgia is a tiny nation, but it's really complicated. There were multiple attempts to flare up those regions as well in the 90s when Soviet Union was falling apart. There was massive conflicts in Migrelian region, for example. Basically, going into the 90s when Soviet Union fell apart, it was a horrible, I'm sorry to say this, but a shit show. It was mix of nationalistic, still communist, still progressive. It was a mix mash of any ideology, any beliefs, and everyone tried to come into power. There was basic. It's so complicated. Even me trying to simplify it is my brain is hurting trying to simplify it. During the 90s, freedom movement of Georgia was led by Gamsahurdia, which was a nationalist Georgian leader who basically spearheaded the Georgian independence movement. I'm not going to get deep into what happened and the whole conflict because it's very, very complicated and very recent. So we have a lot of information, a lot of conflicting informations because people in that conflict are basically still alive. And later on, Soviet Union's foreign minister and second Georgian president, Eduard Shevardnadze, who was also regional leader of Georgia before that, those two had a serious conflict, which I am not going to get into. There was massive civil war between people who supported Gamsahurdia and people who supported Shevardnadze. And there was a massive conflict, which thankfully Russians armed both sides. So there was a massive casualties on both sides. Even though I really shit on Russians and really criticize them, I can't not underestimate how much those conflicts and ethnic tensions and those stupidity is our own fault. Russians just pour gasoline and give us guns and explosives to kill ourselves. So mostly, basically, without our own stupidity, there wouldn't be a conflict. But even the smallest stupidity that exists, Russians will finance it and give it guns and create all this chaos. So basically, in the 90s, Russians were just basically watching us flail about, giving both sides weapons and creating massive terror throughout all of Georgia. During that time, they also armed Abkhazians and South Ossetians to create more conflict. Those wars and conflicts are also really complicated, and I'm going to make a dedicated video later on when I research this topic much better, because again, it's really recent, really painful, wounds are still fresh, so I don't want to get deep into this conflict right now. And also Ajaran region also tried to secede, and there was a whole conflict there. There was marauding bands of criminals. It was 90s was a criminal hellhole. Everything fell apart. True anarchy. Anarchy it's in its purest form. It was pure anarchy. Everyone was against everyone. Only law was criminal law. So they came into power. And it was an unbelievable mess. All of that mess being financed and armed by Russians, KGB agents. Not to forget that KGB institutions was established in Georgia as well, and all those old KGB agents are still alive and living as those politicians, as millionaires, as even in the church there are a lot of KGB agents, known and registered KGB agents that we know. So a lot of I do not trust any politician that was alive in the 80s and the early 90s, because I automatically assume they are a KGB agent, because probably they are. So this whole mess and conflict was, so again, we were the idiots who were fighting each other. Russians were just arming us. So blame is on both sides. Well, blame is on us for still trusting them. And now we come to modern age when I was alive, and now the topic is in within my living memory. So there was a in 2003 was a Rose Revolution when Georgians ousted our previous president Edward Shevardnadze, who was pro-Russian, and new political party and new president Saakashvili came into power, which who tried to modernize and westernize Georgia as fast as possible. As I tried to establish in the video, Georgia was always trying to connect to Europe and to West after the fall of Constantinople, and throughout Russian imperialism, we tried to establish Western style democracy in Georgia multiple times, and this time we were actually on the track of it. But Russia perceived it as a direct threat, because not because it was a threat of their territorial integrity and independence. No, people are listen. Never believe what Russian says. One thing to learn: do not believe. Russians are basically afraid of Georgia and Ukraine and other Eastern European regions becoming part of NATO or part of European Union, because they would have trouble conquering us again. They were planning to take us over from the start. It was just a few years past, like in the to them it's the same as our 3 year independence during the 1920s. They are just uh, rearming and creating new ideology, and to spread and take over Eastern Europe once more. So that is what they are afraid of, that they wouldn't be able to take over their old colonial oppressed regions. So because of that, Russia prepared for many years to invade Georgia. We could there was talks, even I remember as a child, there were talks about Russian invasion in 2004 and 2006, where Russia, Putin basically rounded up all Georgians he could find, like hundreds and thousands of Georgian immigrants, put them in cargo ships and threw them out of the country to flare up ethnic tensions. I don't know what was the main goal of it. But after that, after many years of planning, Georgia, out of nowhere, attacked its own regions, and Russia had to come in and save poor Georgia by bombing it in 2008. I was 10 years old back then, and I was vacationing in my family friend's home, and it's not a nice experience waking up one day and being told that you are being bombed and we have to run away. And basically, everything that is going on in Ukraine right now, I went through as a child. Not as long, of course, it was 5 days, but of course, trouble went on for far longer. And I really sympathize with the Ukrainians right now, especially children. It's really traumatizing to experience. Okay, and I'm not going to get deeper into this war as well. I'm trying to create a general picture. This video is already super long and I apologize for it. I tried my best to keep it as short as possible. Now, basically, we have come to modern day. History is being written as we speak. And Georgia, of course, is fully involved in the conflict that is going on in Ukraine right now. Even not just being sympathetic to them, and a lot of Georgians going into this conflict. A lot of Georgians went there because they knew this whole history that was behind Russian imperialism and to defend Ukraine. And by defending Ukraine, they would defend Georgia as well, because Russia not only planned to invade Ukraine, they were also planning to invade Georgia and Moldova as well. This is not a theory, this is not something to be debated. South Ossetian president announced referendum that they were planning to join Russian Federation. That is an active declaration of war, basically. The territory that we recognize as part of our own was joining Russia. Thus, its war was inevitable there. If Ukraine didn't win this conflict, we would be in war right now. This is a fact. Or Georgia would be our government, like our first government in 1920s, would literally run away and leave us high and dry. That is also a possibility and something that I wouldn't be surprised with our current government. Speaking of our current government, a lot of talk about Georgia is that Georgia has a pro-Russian government. Basically, Russia, not only militarily but ideologically, has been working on the whole world to destabilize it. Russian military sucks, but their spy network is amazing. Western Europe and especially America has witnessed what Russian troll farms can do, but same pressure has been applied, even greater pressure has been applied to Europe and especially Eastern European regions and the other post-Soviet regions to create more nostalgia for Soviet Union and demand by the people to create pro-Russian governments, mostly spearheaded by those Gruzins, as I mentioned, those Russified Georgians who thrived during Russian Soviet occupation of Georgia. So basically, Russia has been trying to create their own puppet governments and puppet political movements all around post-Soviet space, especially in Georgia. There have been a rise of fascistic mentality in a lot of older populations who grew up under Soviet Union. Most of the young people are against it, but there are a few, basically mostly it's older population Georgians who remember the Soviet Union and are nostalgic to that period. We refer to them, as I mentioned, Gruzins. Gruzin is basically means Gruzin is Russian for Georgian, and because all of them have a giant alcoholic, like giant bellies, all those alcoholics have. So there have been a lot of tensions in Georgia, and our current government has been playing the policy of non-intervention and non-aggression. Basically, their whole political stance is let's try to stand still and not make a sound, and hopefully the Russian bear doesn't notice us. And they will be too busy eating other people while we are hiding in the corner and hoping for God to save us. That has been modern Georgian policy with a modern political movement of Georgian Dream, which came after Saakashvili's the Nationalist Party, which again is a very, very complicated issue. But a lot of Georgians blame, honestly, so it was a lot of politically miscalculated moves that led to 2008 conflict. It was, I must say, the conflict was unavoidable, but it could have been played and maneuvered much, much better than what Saakashvili and his political party did. And also, while Saakashvili's party, the nationalist movement, claimed to be pro-European and progressive, quote unquote, they just became another criminal government who used a lot of repressive acts like arresting political opponents, killing independent businessmen who were not aligning with their political schemes. So they became just another gangster movement that just kicked out the competition. And the whole point of this Georgian dream was supposed to be create more stable and more peaceful Georgia that would be less inclined to start any conflicts and more try to have diplomatic relationships with those regions that are trying to secede. But they didn't do any of that. They just created a weaker state of Georgia, which is, I'm not, again, not going into deep into this topic, but many are saying that Georgian dream is pro-Russian government. I would say they are doing a lot of things that could be construed that way, but honestly, I think they're not pro-Russian. They're pro, I wouldn't say, they're useful idiots, basically. But I would, if I was in the same situation, I don't know what I would have done, because we are in a tight spot right now as a nation. There is a conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. There's conflict in Central Europe. There's conflict in Eastern Europe. There's conflict in Iran. All of our neighboring nations are in some sort of conflict. We are stuck in the middle. A lot of people and a lot of Ukrainians are asking Georgians to participate, like open up a second front and attack from below. Like a lot of people are saying, why isn't Georgia trying to retake the territories from Russia while they're busy in Ukraine? Answer is twofold. One, we do not want to fight them. We do not want to fight neither Abkhazians nor South Ossetians. We as a nation believe that they are our brothers, misled by Russian propaganda and brainwashing. We believe that we can find a peaceful solution to this conflict where we don't have to shed more blood and find some sort of understanding and unity as soon as Russia leaves. But as long as Russia is there, peace and understanding is impossible. But there are other more gung-ho population who believe that there is no possibility of peaceful negotiations and we need to take up arms. But to that, unfortunately, currently, Georgian government has no capacity to fight a war. After 2008, rather than prepare for an inevitable conflict with Russia that everyone knew was going to happen either today or Zeg, it was inevitable. Rather than prepare for a conflict, our new government did the opposite, destabilized and dismantled the governmental system, the army that we already had. Our military capacity is far worse than we had in 2008. It is again a complicated topic that I need to do a lot of research to make an honest video about it. I can do it in this long rambling video. So, this is the situation that is here today, right now. We are, as a country, incapable of fighting in this war, but a lot of people who have experience from that war and a lot of volunteers, unfortunately, I don't have any experience, any combat experience, other than fake sword fighting and making armor, or meant for like Middle Ages. That is a great shame of mine that I can't be any use in this conflict, unfortunately. I can't help Ukraine or Georgia. If war starts, of course, I'm going into the front lines, but I'm not trained in any way. We are not able to participate militarily, but a lot of people, as I said, are going into this conflict on their own and are enlisting in foreign legions. Georgian, there are multiple Georgian legions actually, and fighting on the front lines because if Russia wins in Ukraine, they are coming for us. If Russia loses in Ukraine, they're not coming for anyone else ever, at least for a few decades. So we have a open door policy. Basically, anyone can come in and stay as long as they want. For a few months, they have to like few days go out of the country, come back. So you can basically hack Georgian immigration, so you can stay as long as you want. So this created a perfect opportunity for Russians to migrate towards Georgia. First wave was more tolerable because they were younger, more intellectual, had their own money, and weren't as many. There were a lot, but there weren't as many as now. And they were far more self-sufficient because most of them worked from computers. They didn't need to find any jobs. They had constant income. But the second wave that has been running away from mobilization, a lot of them have been directly stating they're pro-Russia, but they don't want to be mobilized. A lot of them have been found out to be active fascists for Russian side. A lot of Russian propagandists have been found in Georgia, and a lot of basically, I don't want to get into too deep into this, but the second wave is much more problematic, and they don't have as much of disposable income. There have been a lot of cases where Russians go into a rented house, stop paying, and refuse to leave, and our government, the police, is uh, incapable of kicking them out without few months in advance warning. It's kind of a whole different issue, and I've personally met a lot of homeless and begging Russians in the street who, like, some of them are women. All of them that are met are either too elderly to be conscripted in the army or are women, and well, all of them are drunk, but that's a different topic. But like, a lot of the people that are coming here are obviously not running away from mobilization, and those that are running away from mobilization are just basically becoming a burden. So the situation that this whole mass exodus from Russia and exodus into Georgia created is that housing market is completely ruined. No normal Georgian can rent a house right now. It has been tripled and quadrupled. Prices have been going up and up. Everyday prices of everyday foods have been increasing drastically. And while first great increase of prices was because lari price went down, but because Russians came in and are just buying dollars as much as possible, actually stabilized lari. But it's okay. It's complicated. Complicated. Again, topic for the next time. But the situation that has been created also I want to mention that traffic was always terrible, especially in metros and in buses, and general traffic has been terrible. But right now it's basically unlivable, untravelable. It's all this massive amount of influx of people. Tbilisi was already over capacity. It was already there wasn't already enough space for Georgians before Russians, thousands and thousands of Russians came, and basically this is creating a lot of tension. Georgians are letting them stay right now because we are incapable of letting a guest turn, like, it's in our national nature. It's I can't like go to a Russian and be mean to them or tell them get out of here. You're not welcome here. I if even if I wanted to, I am physically incapable of doing it. It's against my whole national character. What I think I should be or what I think a Georgian should be. But the situation has become dramatically, and it's going and it's going. Russians are still coming in, creating this tension. I don't know how this will end. And Russia, Putin himself, directly made a threat against Georgians that if anything happens, and anything might happen, anything happens, they will directly intervene. Even if those Russians that are coming in are anti-Putin and anti-government and are very nice people, I assume most of them are nice and normal people, they can be used as justification to invade Georgia. So every Russian that is coming to Georgia is basically creating a direct threat for our national security. But our government is refusing to do anything about it because our government is benefiting from it. Basically, I don't think Georgia should be responsible for the safekeeping of so many Russians. I'm not saying that Georgia should close its borders because Georgian border is one of the few ways Russians can leave right now, and I don't think we should force them to stay in the country. I think we should first give them the chance to avoid mobilization. A lot of people are saying that we should keep Russians in and force them to start a revolution. Those people have never met a Russian before. Unfortunately, I don't think Russians are capable or are willing to start a revolution because honestly, most of them support this conflict. I'm not saying that there are no good Russians who are kind and special and hate imperialism and don't want. Sure, of course, there are few tiny minority of Russians who are normal, decent human beings. But unfortunate truth is that majority of Russians are still bent on the ideas of Russian imperialism, la Russian glory, the Ruski Mir, trali. So, and if they weren't, and if they were opposed to it, and if they hated it, I still don't think they are capable of starting a revolution. All their revolutions were started either by Jews, Georgians, Armenians, and other minorities. The Russian people have historically never taken charge of their lives. They were always, unfortunately, subject to someone else's rule. Well, I am hoping that I'm wrong, and I'm hoping that Russians will fight for their freedom, tear down tyrannical structures, and but now, not because of anything, just simply because if that happens, Russia wouldn't exist. Russia would not exist as a free country because Russia by itself isn't free. It's a prison of nations. That's the fact. People look at Russia and somehow see a country that is, for decades now, like, how can you look at such a massive landmass and think, oh yeah, that's one of those nation states that I've heard about? No, it's a remnant Mongolic empire. It's just another horde, Russian horde. So, I hope for the Russian people best. I hope, but I don't think Georgia should be responsible for their hopes and dreams and future. Especially, I don't think we should give them residency, permanent residency, because, well, Russians are historically terrible guests. That's unfortunately the fact. They don't know when to leave. They don't know that they're guests and that is not their house, and they like to feel at home everywhere and demand that you speak Russian. They never learned. I know people who are ethnically Russians who were born and raised here and were elderly people, 80 years old. They never learned Georgian. Imagine you are born and raised in a country and you never even think about learning few words in that language. That's unfortunately the Russian character. There are, of course, there are good Russians too. They exist as well. But most of the country is still Russian. So, I hope for the best, but I don't think we should let so many in this small country. We just don't have resources for them. And what happens next? What happens when Russia, for example, falls apart, or there's even greater economical upheaval? Do we take every Muscovite? Do we like turn Georgia into like 90% Russians because we let half of the Moscow population in? I don't think that it is our responsibility to take care of them. They can go to other nations they bombed and destroyed. They can go to Syria. They can go to Ukraine. They can go to, I don't know, Poland if they are let in. They can go to Afghanistan. I think Afghanistan is really nice this part of year. They can, all the people, they can go there. They probably will be welcome as much or more there than here, because it's stable kinda right now, but I don't know what future holds, especially after Ukrainian victory. So, thank you for watching. I apologize for such a long video. If you are interested in this kind of ramble vlogs, I'll try to make them, but I don't want to turn my channel into a vlog channel, into one of those Ruski-Pruski vlog channels, Mr. Ruski vlog channels. I don't want to be Mr. Georgian. I want to make regular high quality as I can content about history, culture, mythology, fiction, stuff like that. And I hope for everyone's best. And I also would ask if any of the Russian bloggers that live in Georgia see this video, please stop promoting Georgia as a hot spot destination for your friends. Please stop it.